gig for the CIA. Who calls you for that?
Yeah.
You ever get one of those calls?
No.
No, I never got one of those calls.
And my agent never hit me with that.
I believe Erika Kirk was fully aware of and helped facilitate the plot to her husband. We're going to start by breaking down an interview that she did just 8 days after his...
Does anybody know anything about Charlie clearance? I just saw a video about this, and it had literally never occurred to me that no one is talking about. We have not heard from or seen footage of anybody other than Erika and the freaking vice president.
This story just crossed a line from speculation into something way more serious. And now people aren't just asking what happened. They're asking who's really pulling strings behind the scenes. Because after recent podcast conversations, including commentary tied to Joe Rogan, the narrative around Erika Kirk and the family of Charlie Kirk has taken a sharp turn into conspiracy territory. Claims about plans, timing, influence, and even attempts to silence voices close to him, including his sister. But here's the thing. When you strip away the shock factor, what you're left with is a situation where rumors, commentary, and interpretation are all colliding at once. You've got podcast discussions raising questions, online communities connecting dots, and older clips being reanalyzed like they hold hidden meaning. And once that happens, the story doesn't just evolve, it multiplies, with each version sounding more intense than the last. So now the real question isn't just, what did Rogan say? It's why those claims are spreading so fast, and what's actually real versus what's being amplified. To understand this situation clearly, you have to separate what was actually discussed from how it's being interpreted online. Joe Rogan, during conversations on his podcast, has a long track record of exploring controversial ideas, asking open-ended questions, and entertaining theories without necessarily confirming them as facts. In discussions involving Erika Kirk, the focus was largely on unusual details people had already been talking about online. Things like past appearances, odd clips, and questions about how certain opportunities came about. But here's where things start to shift. Those conversations, which are often speculative in nature, were quickly turned into more definitive claims by people online. Comments about timing, influence, or connections were taken and reframed as evidence of something coordinated or intentional, even though no verified proof was presented. And that's a key distinction, because asking questions or discussing possibilities is very different from confirming that something actually happened. At the same time, other voices and commentators began layering their own interpretations on top, referencing family dynamics, tensions, and the relatively low public visibility of certain individuals, including Charlie's sister. That absence of visibility, whether intentional or simply personal choice, became another piece of the puzzle people tried to explain, it leading to theories about silence, control, or exclusion. But again, none of that has been officially confirmed, and without direct statements or verified information, those ideas remain in the realm of speculation. What's happening here is a classic example of how modern media works. One conversation sparks another, clips get shared out of context, and before long, a discussion turns into a narrative that feels much more concrete than it actually is. And once that narrative gains traction, it becomes difficult to separate the original discussion from everything that's been added on top of it. So at this stage, what we have isn't a confirmed plan or verified plot. It's a combination of podcast commentary, online interpretation, and growing speculation. And understanding that difference is crucial, because without it, it becomes easy to mistake conversation for confirmation. And that's where stories like this can quickly spiral beyond what's actually known. Now, this is where the situation really starts to spiral. Because once those podcast clips and conversations involving Joe Rogan hit social media, the story didn't just stay as a discussion, it evolved into something much bigger. What originally started as questions and observations quickly got picked up, reposted and reinterpreted across different platforms, and with every repost, the tone shifted slightly. By the time it reached a wider audience, what began as speculation was being presented by some people as if it were a confirmed storyline involving Erika Kirk and the family of Charlie Kirk. And this is how narratives build momentum online. One person connects a few dots. Another person adds more context. Someone else fills in the gaps with assumptions. And suddenly, you have a full story that feels complete, even though it's based on pieces that haven't been officially verified. In this case, elements like family tension, the timing of public appearances, and the limited visibility of certain relatives, especially Charlie's sister, became central talking points. People began asking why some voices were more visible than others, and instead of waiting for clear answers, theories started forming to explain that imbalance. At the same time, older clips and unrelated content started resurfacing and being reanalyzed. Moments that previously didn't attract much attention were now being viewed through a completely different lens, with people looking for patterns, hidden meanings, or anything that could support the growing narrative. And once that process starts, it's hard to stop, because every new piece of content becomes another opportunity to reinforce what people already believe. Another factor that accelerated everything was the involvement of multiple commentators. When different public figures start discussing the same topic, even if they're just sharing opinions or asking questions, it creates the impression that there must be something substantial behind it. That doesn't necessarily make the claims true, but it does make them feel more credible to the audience. And in a fast-moving online environment, perception can spread faster than verification. This is also where the emotional side of the story comes into play. Situations involving family, legacy, and loss naturally draw strong reactions. And when those emotions mix with uncertainty, people are more likely to look for explanations that feel satisfying, even if they're not fully supported by evidence. That's why theories about control, silence, or hidden motives can gain traction so quickly. They provide a sense of clarity in a situation that otherwise feels incomplete. So at this point, the narrative isn't being driven by confirmed updates. It's being driven by interpretation. Each new post, clip, or comment adds another layer, making the story feel more detailed and more convincing, even though the core facts haven't changed. And until there's clear, verified information that addresses these questions directly, this cycle is likely to continue. Because once a narrative reaches this level of momentum, it doesn't just fade away. It keeps evolving. And now, this is where the conversation gets even more sensitive, because a big part of the narrative online has shifted toward the role of Charlie's family, especially his sister, and what people perceive as her absence from the spotlight. Charlie Kirk had a very public presence, but not everyone in his family operated the same way, and that difference has become a major talking point. Instead of clear public statements or frequent appearances, his sister has remained relatively private, and that silence, whether intentional or simply personal, has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some people see it as normal, a choice to stay out of the public eye during a difficult time. Others, however, have started to question whether there's more behind it, especially when compared to how visible Erika Kirk has been in handling public messaging and legacy-related matters. And this contrast is what's fueling a lot of the speculation. When one person is highly visible and another is not, people naturally start asking why, and in the absence of clear answers, they begin creating their own explanations. That's where theories start forming, ideas about control, influence, or disagreements behind the scenes. But it's important to recognize that none of those interpretations have been officially confirmed. What we're seeing is a gap in information, and that gap is being filled by assumptions rather than verified facts. At the same time, differences in perspective within families are not unusual, especially when it comes to legacy, public image, and how someone's work should be carried forward. On one side may prioritize continuing public engagement and messaging, while another may focus on privacy or a different direction entirely. Those differences don't automatically mean there's conflict, but when viewed from the outside, especially through social media, they can easily be framed that way. This is also where the narrative begins to drift further from confirmed information. Claims about someone being silenced or pushed out are serious, But without direct evidence or statements from those involved, they remain speculative. However, because those claims are tied to an already emotional and high-profile situation, they spread quickly and gain attention, even if they're not backed by proof. So what we're really looking at here is a combination of visibility, interpretation, and missing context. The presence of Erika Kirk in public-facing roles and the relative absence of Charlie's sister have created a contrast that people are trying to explain. But the explanations being offered online are not the same as confirmed reality. And until there's direct clarification from those involved, that contrast will continue to be one of the main drivers of speculation in this story. At this point, it's critical to draw a clear line between what's actually known and what's being assumed, because the story has reached a level where speculation is starting to sound like fact, and that's where things can get misleading. Conversations involving Joe Rogan, online commentary, and viral clips have definitely pushed this situation into the spotlight, but none of those elements on their own confirm the more extreme claims being circulated. Ideas about secret plans, coordinated actions, or attempts to silence individuals, especially involving Erika Kirk and the family of Charlie Kirk, are serious allegations, and as of now they remain unverified. What is real is that there has been a noticeable shift in how the story is being discussed. Early on, the focus was more on public appearances, legacy decisions, and who was taking the lead in continuing Charlie's work. But as more commentary and opinions entered the conversation, the tone changed. Now, instead of just asking who's in charge, people are asking why certain things happened the way they did, and in some cases jumping to conclusions to answer that question. This is a pattern we see often in high-profile situations. When there's limited official information, people start connecting dots on their own. While some of those connections might be reasonable questions, others can go much further, turning into full narratives that aren't supported by confirmed evidence. The involvement of well-known voices can amplify this effect, because when a large audience hears something, even if it's speculative, it can quickly take on a sense of credibility. It's also important to recognize how quickly context can get lost. A comment made in a conversational setting, a clip taken out of a longer discussion, or a moment highlighted without full background can all be interpreted in ways that weren't originally intended. And once those interpretations spread, they often become the version of the story that people remember. So right now, the situation sits in a grey area. There are real events, real people, and real decisions being made, but many of the more dramatic claims circulating online don't have confirmed backing. That doesn't mean questions shouldn't be asked. It just means those questions shouldn't automatically be treated as answers. And until there are clear statements, verified reports, or legal outcomes that provide more concrete information, the most accurate way to view this story is as an evolving situation, one where facts, opinions, and speculation are all being mixed together. The challenge is separating them, and right now, that's exactly what makes this story so complicated and so widely debated. When you step back and look at everything without the noise, this situation starts to look less like a mystery and more like a classic power struggle over legacy, influence, and control. At the center of it all is the name and impact of Charlie Kirk, a name that represents not just a person, but a brand, a platform, and a movement with real reach. And whenever something that big is involved, questions about who gets to control it don't just stay private, they become public and sometimes messy. On one side, you have Erika Kirk, who has been visible, active, and positioned at the front of continuing that legacy. On the other side, you have family members who, whether quietly or legally, appear to be asserting their own role in how that legacy is handled moving forward. And this is where perception plays a huge role. To some people, Erika stepping forward looks like leadership, someone taking responsibility and keeping things moving. To others, it raises questions about authority and whether that role was fully hers to take. At the same time, the the family's quieter approach can be interpreted in completely different ways, either as respectful distance or as strategic patience before making more formal moves. Neither interpretation is confirmed, but both are shaping how people see the situation. This also explains why the narrative has escalated so quickly. When you combine public visibility, limited direct communication from all sides, and a high-profile legacy, it creates the perfect environment for speculation. People aren't just reacting to what's happening, they're reacting to what they think is happening behind the scenes. And once those assumptions take hold, every action gets analysed more deeply, every detail gets questioned, and every silence gets filled with meaning. Another important factor is that influence today isn't just about legal control. It's also about public perception. Whoever the audience believes is the true representative of Charlie's legacy will naturally hold a certain level of power, regardless of what's happening legally behind the scenes. That's why both visibility and narrative matter so much in situations like this. So when people talk about plans, control, or hidden motives, what they're really reacting to is this underlying tension. Who gets to define what Charlie's name stands for going forward? And until that question is clearly answered, whether through legal clarity or public statements, this situation will continue to feel like an ongoing power struggle rather than a resolved story. Right now, everything comes down to what happens next, and more importantly, who steps forward to clarify things first. Because as it stands, this situation involving Erika Kirk, the family of Charlie Kirk, and the wider conversation amplified by voices like Joe Rogan is still unfolding in real time. There's no confirmed final outcome, no official resolution, and no single narrative that everyone agrees on. And that uncertainty is exactly what's keeping the story alive. From here, there are a few possible directions this could go. One is increased clarity, either through public statements, interviews, or legal developments that clearly define who holds what role and authority moving forward. Another is continued silence from key individuals, which would likely keep fueling speculation and allow online narratives to keep evolving on their own. And then there's the possibility of a structured resolution behind the scenes, something that may not be fully public, but still impacts how the legacy is managed going forward. There's also the reality that public perception will continue to shape this story just as much as any official development. In today's digital environment, the way people interpret events can influence outcomes almost as much as the events themselves. If the audience leans toward one version of the story, that perception can carry weight, even before all the facts are fully known. At the same time, it's important to recognize that not every question will necessarily get a clear answer. Some situations, especially those involving private family matters and complex legacies, don't resolve in a way that satisfies public curiosity. And that can leave room for ongoing debate, even after the main developments have settled. So now it's your turn. After everything we just broke down, do you think this is simply a case of different people trying to handle a legacy in their own way? Or do you believe there's more going on beneath the surface? And when it comes to the claims and conversations that have been spreading, where do you draw the line between questioning and jumping to conclusions? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this is one of those stories where perspective really shapes the narrative. If you want more deep, real breakdowns like this, no hype, just clarity, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay locked in. Because if anything new comes out, you already know we're going to break it down next.